We're going to talk about AI. One of the things that I am very conscious of is that AI has been in the news a lot. It's very hard to open up the news and not find something related to AI at the moment. But the thing is, we're not really engaging with some of the bigger discussions about AI, especially as the church. I think AI has the potential to be a wonderful thing in our world, but also has the potential to be a challenge in our world. My hope today is not to present like a doom-mongering case or be, one of these let's just run headfirst into AI and see what happens. I want to present somewhere in the middle that just says, hey, hang on, let's just be a bit cautious here. It's going to be a huge issue. I believe that it's going to be something that will shape our world. People are referring to it already as kind of the next industrial revolution in terms of how it shifts our society. There's a journalist called Jacob Stern who describes it as an everything issue because it does impact so much. I think what I'm concerned about in terms of our discussion is how it impacts the church. So that's what we're going to focus on. In order to get there, I want to go through this roadmap. We're going to start by talking about a brief history of AI. Then we're going to talk about AI's potential impact on society. Hey, Brandy. Then we're going to talk about AI's potential impact on the church, 7 guidelines for churches, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion. The reason we're going this way, and it kind of looks like a pyramid, is because I want us to all be on the same page by the time we get to the discussion. Some of you might be familiar with the history of AI. Some of you won't be. Some of you might understand the societal stuff that's going on. Some of you won't be. So with that in mind, let's start right from the beginning. We'll talk about a brief history of AI. Now, for a lot of us, AI will feel really new. It feels like it would have just come in the last year or so because that's when it's really exploded into prominence. But the reality is, it's not new. It's something that's been around for a long time. In fact, even before Jesus, there was a Greek myth about Talos. Talos was this great big hulking automaton that walked around fused with this stuff called Ica, would walk around the island of Crete and defend it from encroaching invaders. This was a myth. This is what a scholar called Adrienne Meyer suggests might be the first kind of conceptual idea of something like artificial intelligence, or it's at least the first that we can find. So it goes back a really long way. What's super interesting about this is that Jesus and his disciples and all the Jews of that time would have been aware of some of these Greek myths as the Hellenization of that area came in, as the Greek culture came in. They would have been aware of some of those myths. And Jesus could very well have said, hey, the myth of Talos? Here's some information about artificial intelligence. He doesn't do that. I want to say that because I think as we start to worry about kind of existential issues, Jesus could very well have addressed this stuff and didn't, because ultimately I think it's not his primary concern for many reasons. So that was kind of the conception of Talos. We've seen robots and things like that come up. But really, it was a guy called Alan Turing, a British computer scientist who grew up not far away from where I grew up, actually. In the 1930s, he was in his early 20s. He would have been about the same age as like Jaden, Chet, Amber, would have been kind of a little bit older than you. He developed this concept called universality. Universality is best described by a guy called Stuart Russell, who says, it means that humans do not need separate machines for arithmetic, machine translation, chess, speech understanding, or animation. One machine could do it all. This was back in the 1930s, where they were like, maybe one day we'll see a world where one machine could do all of these things. This concept of universality was huge. Now it's something that we take for granted. It's been around for a while. And then in the 1950s, Alan Turing released this groundbreaking paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, where he introduced something called the imitation game. You might recognize the name, the imitation game. Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing. He eventually came up with something that would be known as the Turing test. And we still use the Turing test today to try and figure out whether something has achieved AI or not. It's basically a test to say, is it on the same level as humans or not? Why is that important? It's important because even as far back as the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, people were discussing artificial intelligence. It's not just some fad. I think that's something we need to be clear about. That will become more and more apparent as we go through this brief history of AI. It's not just something that has suddenly appeared that now we have to wrestle with. It's something that people have been talking about for a long, long time. So in the 1950s, there was all sorts of stuff happening. In particular, something called the Dartmouth Summer Research Project. This was where the term artificial intelligence was first used. So again, we're talking a long time ago that the term AI was first used, or artificial intelligence, I should say. During the 50s, there was someone called Julian Huxley. You might recognize the name of his brother, Aldous Huxley. Julian Huxley published an essay introducing an idea called transhumanism. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but just tuck that away because that's going to be important in a moment. By the 1960s, suddenly there was conversations about something called superintelligence. So there's a guy called I.J. Good who suggested that one day we might arrive at a place where there would unquestionably be an intelligence explosion and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. So this was, again, in the 1960s. We're talking about the theoretical side of this stuff, where someone was thinking, actually, this could be a big deal if artificial intelligence develops to a certain place. We'll talk about that more in a moment too. Now, by the 1970s, things cooled down a bit into what is now referred to as the first AI winter. So basically, there wasn't enough money, there wasn't enough interest, the technology wasn't there. So interest kind of dried up a little bit. By 1980, Japan got involved. And so what happened was America was kind of leading the way in the quest for artificial intelligence. And through a series of circumstances, there was almost like a technological Cold War with Japan. And Japan said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do something called the Fifth Generation Computer Systems Project, which means that they invested $400 million, which is an incredible amount of money back then, into something called the Fifth Generation Computer Systems Project in a race to get there before the West, which failed. They didn't get there. Again, the technological limitations and disinterest meant that basically we arrived at a second AI winter in the early 1990s. So interest cooled again. Basically, people were trying to get there and realized that where we were at technologically just couldn't get us there. There was something really important that happened in 1997 called IBM's Deep Blue project. Some of you might recognize that name. Basically, it was the first time a computer beat a chess champion. And it was a huge deal. It caught a lot of attention in the news. And it gained significant interest the world gained significant interest in AI off the back of this. This was a big deal. I think it was Kasparov, I think his name was. Now, nothing else really happened until 2012. There were lots of incremental developments, but in 2012, something happened that was referred to as AI's Big Bang. There's a guy called Jeff Hinton. He was leading a team to basically take part in a competition to see who could do the best kind of image recognition. And he developed something called neural networks, which we hear a lot about now, but at the time that was new. He developed something called neural networks, which basically radically improved a computer's ability to recognize images. For example, to recognize that a cat was a cat or something like that. And it became basically an enormous moment because you've got Facebook, you've got Google, you've got Microsoft, you've got all these other companies around, and they recognized this in Jeff Hinton's work and realized, oh, this could be huge. So suddenly the investment came pouring in. And so the last 11, 12 years have seen rapid developments in AI. Last year, the year before last now, a company called OpenAI, who are a relatively small company compared to the others, but with a guy called Sam Altman and Elon Musk, they created this company and they released ChatGPT. And that was when suddenly AI exploded into the mainstream because they, through ChatGPT, basically every company going could use something called an API to access ChatGPT's information to then, I have an app called Noom, for example. I can then suddenly type a question into Noom and it uses ChatGPT. And pretty much if you're looking at any kind of chatbot online. Most of them are using ChatGPT, which is something called a large language model. We might talk about that in a minute. So that's kind of a really brief whistle-stop tour through history. Amber. Oh my goodness. Something transformer. It doesn't make sense to me. You have to remember that I am not a computer scientist. If someone could look it up and tell us, that would be great. Oh yeah. Okay. So for context, Chet is in the room. I produced something called Chet GPT rather than Chat GPT, which had Chet's personality in it, which was, for me, the most funny thing ever. Any other questions about the history of AI before we can move on to the next section? Cool, straightforward. The idea is here is just to lay a foundation. What is it? What does the Chat GPT stand for? Yes. Okay. Cool. Is that helpful for you, Amber? Probably not. Okay, so let's talk about AI's potential impact on society. First, I think to do anything, we need to understand the AI landscape as it stands. Now, some of this might go over your head, and that's okay. Some of it might make sense. Hopefully, I'll explain it in a way that will make sense. We are currently at a place where we have achieved what's really called artificial narrow intelligence. So we refer to it as AI, but really what it is artificial narrow intelligence, which means it can do certain things really well, like a narrow thing quite well, specific tasks. So for example, ChatGPT is basically, it's a chat interface using something called a large language model, which is able to predict the right answer based on millions upon millions upon millions of websites, basically. So that's very good at creating language responses. It's not very good at things like math, for example. It's getting better, but it's not very good at those kinds of things at the moment. So that's where we are right now. There's quite a lot of forms of artificial narrow intelligence. Like if you use Amazon or Netflix, they will use artificial narrow intelligence to figure out what kind of what you should watch or what you should buy. Hospitals often use artificial narrow intelligence to figure out which bed to put you in and things like that. So it's everywhere. This is where we're at. We're not too concerned about this yet. Then you've got something called artificial general intelligence. This is where it can replicate the intellectual ability or the general intellectual ability of humans in all areas. So we're not a million miles away from this yet, but it's also not beyond our imagination that we can get there pretty soon, in the next kind of few years, potentially decade or so, but we'll get there pretty quick. That's where things get a bit nerve-wracking. Where things get a little bit worrying is when artificial intelligence achieves something called superintelligence. So superintelligence is when artificial intelligence surpasses the abilities of humans in basically every area. At that point, things become a little bit more scary because you can imagine a situation where suddenly an artificial intelligence that is way ahead of us can figure out a way to improve itself faster than we can figure out a way to improve itself. So then it improves, which then gives it more ability to improve, and then it improves. Suddenly it's so far beyond our ability, we achieve something called the singularity, which is where it exponentially increases. And that's where things get a little bit troublesome and we start to worry, because although we might think something like, oh, we could just switch it off, it's not that easy. It's a bit more complicated than that with the way the servers that we live in have and all this kind of stuff. So it looks like this on a graph. It starts off fairly slow, and then all at once, suddenly explodes. That's the area that there is a little bit of concern about. This idea of being able to improve itself so quickly. There's a quote here. I can't remember who it's by, but it says, "It's the point where technological progress becomes so rapid and exponential that it results in a future where machines can create and improve upon their own designs faster than humans can." That's a little bit worrying, but also quite far away. We're not. Some people predict that we could be there by the 2040s, which is not too far away, but other people will say actually it's 30, 40, 50 years away. We have lots of time to figure out guardrails and things like that in place. If AI becomes super intelligent, Stephen Hawking said that it would either be the best or worst thing to ever happen to humanity. So there's lots of reasons why it could be phenomenal. There's lots of reasons why it's not good. Elon Musk, who founded OpenAI, left over some of the concerns over this stuff, refused to be involved with OpenAI. He talked about the concerns of something called recursive self-improvement. So his concern is that if researchers designed an AI system to eliminate spam emails, for example, it might conclude that the most effective way to do that is by getting rid of humans. Get rid of humans, no more spam emails. A guy called Nick Bostrom used an example. He's like this Oxford philosopher of what if AI's sole function was to make the most paperclips it possibly can in the most efficient way. It might find that, we've used up all the iron on the planet. I know what we need to do. We need to extract it from human blood. There's those kinds of things that's what people are worrying about. That is not going to be the focus of our concern today, because I think we're quite away from that. But it's important to have this stuff in our mind and realize this is quite serious, actually. In March 2023, so not long ago, over 31,000 people, important people, signed a letter citing profound risks to society and humanity by AI, and expressed an alarm at the lack of planning going on to prevent some of these issues. That's 31,000 computer scientists, prominent figures in society. Later on, I think it was in June, there was a statement on AI risk. This was signed by people like Sam Altman, who runs ChatGPT, who's got skin in the game. It was signed by Elon Musk. I think Bill Gates signed it. And it basically said, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war. So, these are people who are involved with it saying, okay, we need to be careful. Now, I want to balance that by saying it benefits people who are involved in AI to make sure it's in the news. So there is a side of this where there could be a little bit of propaganda going on just to raise awareness of AI and create a sort of hero complex. But the concerns are very real. We just need to be balanced in how we respond. Our response should not be, okay, let's just run into a bunker and hide. We're not quite there yet. So with that in mind, let's talk about some economic considerations. What happens as AI kind of moves into the world here? First of all, if we achieve something called an economic singularity, in other words, AI develops to the point where we become, I love this phrase, a guy called Nick Bostrom, again, he uses it, where we become rich beyond the dreams of avarice. He basically says it could lead to the type of radical abundance that would mean that poverty could be realistically abolished. So the idea is that, let's say you have AI people driving your trucks. Suddenly production goes, the cost of your goods go way down. If you have AI running your admin, and your workforce is powered by AI, you don't pay them. They work 24 hours a day. So you can produce way more at a much lower cost, which means that then we pay less. So assuming we all have jobs still, which is a viable concern, then suddenly our income in relation to the cost of living changes drastically, which could leave us in a place where there's so much abundance that things like universal basic income, which is kind of derided now, which understandably, suddenly there's so much extra that it doesn't impact anyone at all to provide something like that, because you've got people who are trillionaires who don't need, who get taxed and so on like that. I'm not saying I'm not a proponent of that. I'm not against it either. I'm kind of indifferent. What I'm saying is that's a possibility. So you have kind of feasible options for things like that. Suddenly you're in a place where there's potentially so much money left over that you can eradicate homelessness. You can eradicate some of the issues that we have with poverty. You can do that around the world. That's the positive side of it. The negative side is that some people predict as many as 47% of jobs could be replaced by AI pretty soon, particularly in certain nations. Competition for jobs could increase, which as a result could drive down wages, because if you're competing for the same job, you're going to take a lower pay if you're desperate for it. And so that could be a real problem. The gap between the rich and the poor may radically increase, meaning that we kind of get something that looked a bit like the Industrial Revolution, where you have these rich landowners and then you have these impoverished workers just doing whatever they can to make a living. So it could go either way. We don't know which way it's going to go. I spoiler alert, I suspect it would go the negative way and not the positive way, because the Bible doesn't say, as long as there's poverty, help the poor. I think as long as there are humans, there will be needs. So that's some of the economic considerations. We could talk about a lot of things there. There's so much in this. AI is already transforming the way so many people work in terms of productivity, marketing. Pretty much every field is affected by this. That's what makes it different to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was slow and it affected certain industry, didn't affect all jobs, whereas AI affects most, if not all jobs. Soon, if there were self-driving cars, suddenly that's a very different prospect for people who drive for a living. Robots doing manual labor, that's a very different prospect because you can have them working 24 hours a day. There's lots. I mean, imagine if we still have oil, depending on where that goes, suddenly having robots that do a lot of that work, that's a big deal for Albertans. So those are some of the economic considerations. We can talk more about that in a little bit. In terms of cultural considerations, it's going to affect a whole bunch of things. So it's already affecting education. You can use ChatGPT to write your assignments for you. They're going to be garbage at this point, but not for long. They're getting better and better and better. I'm an academic advisor for a Bible college, and I've said to my students, if you want to use AI, go for it. There's no way I can spot it. There's no way a plagiarism checker can check it. I mean, you could get AI to write a paper, for you, and then you just reword it. Suddenly you're free, and you can fake it. So I've said, if you want to do that, I can't stop you, but recognize that your degree won't be worth the paper it's written on. You're eventually going to, we're talking about a Bible college. Eventually, you're going to go into ministry, and you are not going to be a blessing to your congregation. You're not going to be able to serve them well because you won't be equipped properly. So if that's the choice you want to make, go for it. I mean, that's already a big mark on your integrity as it is. And also, I said that if I do find you, and do find out that you've plagiarized, I will hammer you for it. So, but the reality is, you can't hide that. You can hide it, and we can't spot it. It's almost impossible. So it makes things really challenging. Not to mention that when you get information from AI, you don't know if you're plagiarizing or not still at this point, because AI produces stuff that is really just drawn from various sources as it is. That's not to say that AI can't be really positive. So even for me, in writing my assignments, I found AI really helpful to get a broad understanding of a topic and to know where to research, for example. So using it in the right way can be really good. AI is really helpful in doing grammar checks and things like that. So it can be good. It just depends on how you use it. If you use it like a calculator, if you use it as a tool, then great. If you use it as a crutch, that's a problem. That's not going to serve you well. Where it might be really beneficial is things like for my kids who are very little, as they grow up, they're going to have essentially a one-on-one teacher helping them with anything they're struggling with. So, when I was just before the YouTube era, when I was growing up, and so if I was stuck, if I didn't understand what my teacher was saying, and I went home and my parents didn't understand, that was it. Good luck. And so I really struggled with math and biology and chemistry because I didn't have anyone to help. Nowadays, YouTube is phenomenal for that, for helping with studies. But imagine AI being a personal assistant to help you learn. So if you want to learn, it can be the most phenomenal thing. Obviously, if you want to cheat, that's not such a good thing. Amber?
Is like ChatGPT and AI, is it reliable? Like when you go to Google and you Google something, you have to filter through the good stuff and the bad stuff. And then YouTube, what's AI like?
Yeah, so is AI reliable? No. Because it ultimately, when we talk about AI, I refer to ChatGPT because that's what I use. But there's something called Perplexity that's going to get pretty big. That's just been valued at an enormous amount of money. Google Bard, They've got another one that's just Google Gemini. I think it's just come out. I don't know if it's called Gemini. There's various different large language models, and what they do is they scrape through all of the information that they can get. So ChatGPT is kind of in trouble for doing this because some of it's copyrighted information, and they go, "Oh, okay. When the word chair is there, quite often the word table's nearby. So I'm going to look for that, and then you realize, okay, I can predict that that's what's going to be next. When I see discussions about, I don't know, Red Deer, Alberta, I know that there's going to be lots of conversations about Westerner days or something like that, and you can kind of predict some of those things, or Calgary Stampede or whatever, so it learns to predict what letter is going to come next. So it's not thinking. We make the mistake often of thinking that it's thinking, but it's not. It's predicting based on probability, and as it learns, it's got to a point where it used to be trained on humans, where they'd go, no, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right, and we still do that. So when I say, was this response helpful? No, it learns. It learns, and or if you can ask various questions of it, and it kind of learns through this training process, but it's still just predicting letters and numbers and things like that. But going back to education, it can still be a real blessing. I mean, in terms of seminary education, even for people, say, in sub-Saharan Africa, who can't afford to do an expensive degree, they could potentially, in the next 10 years, use ChatGPT to say, okay, teach me about the doctrine of this. Now, with all of this stuff, there's risks and there's positives. So you could say, the more specific you are, the better with these kinds of things. So if you say, in our case, we'd kind of broadly define our church as Reformed Charismatic, would be kind of somewhere where we'd land. So I would say, I am Reformed Charismatic, help me understand the doctrine of this. And so that's often quite helpful. But there's always, all that to say, you always have to keep checking what you're reading, and you can never. The interesting thing is, if you ask for Bible verses, the Bible verses aren't always accurate. So you've got to kind of keep an eye on some of those things as well. It might also radically impact things like our social life, our society. So take social media. Social media has been a blight on society. However way you slice it, we're seeing more and more studies showing that social media has been a massive detriment to society. So since, I think it was 2012, so around then, there's a scientist called Jean Twenge, I'd never know how to pronounce her name, but she noticed that there was a massive spike in the number of mental health breakdowns at universities and mental health challenges. And she noticed way back then that it correlated with the teenagers who had smartphones all the way through their teenage years. And at the time, that was a hypothesis. And over the years, that's just been proven again and again and again to have been massively detrimental. Because if you think about it, many of us grew up in a world where if you got bullied at school, you'd go home and you'd be fine. You'd be safe. You'd be away from the bullies. Whereas now you go home, people can still bully you. People can still give you a hard time. You've got trolls online giving you a brutal time for what you're doing. There's issues with, appearance. The social media world. Suddenly, I was in a world where it was something called MySpace, and then it became, Facebook as I was 18, 19, and suddenly it was all about appearance and the number of friends you had online, and that became a problem. And the Instagram generation has really struggled because there's a lot of comparisons and a lot of fake stuff. And now with AI, we're in a place where we can't even tell if what we're seeing is real or not. It's called deep fakes, and we have the proliferation of fake news. And what I mean by that is not kind of the Donald Trump version of fake news, although that exists, but I mean AI-generated fake news. Literally, an AI system saying, what is going to get the most clicks? Okay, this is going to get the most clicks, therefore I will produce this. We're seeing it all the time. There was quite a famous picture last year or the year before of the Pope in a bomber jacket, in a kind of a gangster jacket. And everyone was like, I don't think the Pope should be wearing something like that. That's not very popely. And actually, it was made up. It wasn't true. In fact, so many of the images that you will find online, it's hard to even tell if they're true or not. There's something called Mid-Journey. There's on ChatGPT, they use something called DALL-E, where you can say, I mean, you've seen me use some of these in my sermons, where you say, create an image of ... So I did one last time. I think the last one I used during my message was create an image of God as a vending machine. Because that was my, I was saying, remember I was using that metaphor where sometimes we treat God as if he's a vending machine where we put in our prayers and expect something to come out. And it created this amazing image, and it can do those kinds of things. I want to be clear, I wasn't trying to produce a picture of God. That feels a bit kind of almost a bit weird, but the vending machine image. I did it when, you might remember me talking about Albert Einstein doing Kung Fu, and I got a picture of that from AI. There's some pretty amazing things you can get, and sometimes you just can't tell whether it's real or not. Some experts predict that listen to this, as much as 90% of online content may be synthetically generated, in other words, created by AI, by 2026. It's not far away. And we're in a place where I think, I'll just be honest, our older generations are quite susceptible to fake news online as it is. But with the rise in AI as well, that's a real concern. We need to be very, very vigilant on what we're seeing. And not just take, say, a Facebook post that says, here's one. In Australia, they used a diesel generator to power electric cars because there wasn't enough electricity, and so that was going round, and that was doing its rounds on the internet. It wasn't true. It was a vast exaggeration based on a very, very partial truth, which was they were in the middle of the outback, and so he was testing a system to see if it could work. But but when you see what the original headline and you don't look into it, I had a friend who was from my Bible school who was sharing it and saying, "It's so ridiculous. This is so dumb." Now, this isn't, I'm kind of indifferent towards electric cars and gas-powered cars, especially when it's -40 in Alberta. You think, that's going to be tricky. But the issue is that we have to pay attention to what we're reading and check it to see if it's true more than ever. Anyway, I'm probably getting ahead of myself. It's also causing relational issues. So again, one of the big concerns we have is that people are more lonely than perhaps ever before. There's lots of things that go into that. There's this rapid rise in individualism. A lot of that is caused by technology. You have people who are very happy to be on their phones, and we'll talk about how lonely they are as they're sat in a crowd full of people on their phone, and not willing to engage with those people. That's the world that we're in, and there's no blame there. That's just the reality of where we're at. There's something called Karen AI, which was produced last year. I think it came out and was a failure. But it was basically this social media influencer called Karen who had produced an AI version of herself that people could pay $1 a minute to connect with and have a relationship with. Now, there were 20,000 people signed up to that. So she was making $20,000 a minute that people were using it. In Japan, apparently, and particularly in the States as well, I think this happened, there are people marrying AIs, which is ridiculous. Obviously, on its face, that's stupid. I think we can be fairly bold about that. But part of me wonders again if that's not just a little bit of propaganda. If I'm honest, I think that seems a little bit too ridiculous. But then I have seen people who have relationships with balloons, for example. So you just never know. You just don't know these days. So there are concerns there. There are concerns around things like authoritarian regimes. With the ubiquity of cameras everywhere and AI-driven facial recognition, and something called big data, where we just have all this information. In the words of someone called Callum Chase, who wrote a book called Surviving AI, he says that these authoritarian regimes could build apparatus of control which would make Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984 look amateurish. So this is one of those other interesting things. There's been lots of talk about China doing something like this, a social credit system. A lot of that has actually been fairly disproven. Again, it's one of those things where, are they doing certain things like that in certain areas? Yes, but it's not quite as extreme as we've been told it is by certain areas. So it's complicated. Is that stuff going on, and should we be very concerned? Absolutely. But is it quite as extreme as we have read it to be? No. I have to admit, I panicked when I first saw that. I was like, this is terrible. We have to rise up against this, and then realized, oh, actually, it's not it's not quite what they said it is. Still very concerned about that, particularly with, say, Christians. Or, I mean, let's talk about warfare. We'll get to that. We'll talk about that because that will impact that discussion. Drone warfare technology is pretty scary at the moment. Israel, a few years ago, before it was ever in this war, used a drone swarm as far back as 2021 to locate and attack terrorists. That's scary. Regardless of whether you think they're on the right side or the wrong side, the fact that you can send a swarm of drones to go and explode on people, that freaks me out. But the US, China, the UK, Russia, India, and Turkey are all working on this kind of technology. Soon, one scientist notes that a swarm of 10,000 AI drones that could be this big and fly in and use facial recognition, use image recognition, and explode an entire city, basically, could theoretically cost as little as $10 million, which, in the scheme of things, in terms of warfare, is nothing. I'm very concerned about what that looks like for ethnic genocides, because you could do horrific damage very quickly. That's a concern for sure. As costs plummet and as AI software becomes open sourced, which basically means that anyone can access what's going on behind the scenes, then nefarious people have all sorts of access to incredibly powerful technology. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And again, we often think of robots taking over the world. Not really sure that that's going to be an issue. I think there'll be enough legislation before we get to that place. That's already starting to happen. What I'm concerned about are humans using it, because we are sinful people, and it's in our nature to do sinful, nasty things, unfortunately. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. In terms of medicine, AI has already helped with medical breakthroughs. So it's discovered certain medicines and things like that already, which is crazy. It can already examine X-rays with greater effectiveness than doctors, which is, again, insane. And will soon be able to conduct surgeries, using AI to conduct surgeries. I don't know who's going to be the brave soul that goes first, but I mean, in theory, you get to a place where a robot is much safer. You're in a much safer pair of hands than a doctor, theoretically. And there have already been examples of AI spotting things that humans have missed on X-rays and things like that, which have been potentially life-saving. So again, potentially exciting, a little bit scary. One of the really scary areas of this is the arena of transhumanism. I wanted to talk about transhumanism a little bit, because within transhumanism is this idea that you can use biotech and things like that to enhance yourself. So Elon Musk is working on a neural link, I guess. I can't remember exactly what it's called, that enhances your brain power and things like that. It's pretty crazy. Or the positive side, let's say you have an arm amputated. You can use AI technology to have a prosthetic arm that can move to your thoughts. That seems wonderful, right? There's some really good things. But transhumanism fundamentally is this philosophical movement that aims to free the human body and mind of their biological limitations, allowing humanity to transcend into a future unconstrained by death. Does anyone else wince when you read that kind of stuff? Yeah, it's pretty scary. Now, according to transhumanists, the mission, the goal is to free themselves from the inferiority of the material world and enjoy a sort of pseudo-spiritual existence in the digital world. Now, that's a concern. I have a lot of concerns about that. First of all, If we start with biotech, and let's say everyone has technology that makes them, I don't know, 40% stronger, and Christians say, I don't know. I don't know if God would want that. Suddenly, you get to a place where people improve so much faster than you and are so much more job capable that suddenly you might come to a place where conscientious objectors, for want of a better phrase, might be out of a job. Or take these neural links. If you have AI supporting your brain power, but people choose not to do that, suddenly they're going to be the dumb ones in the room as these people zoom ahead. Unfortunately, the dumb ones would be the hope. I mean, I would suggest would maybe the ethically conscious ones who aren't going to be able to, keep up with what's going on. It's a pretty scary situation. Transhumanism, I want to talk about more in a minute. We're going to talk about the impact on the church in a moment. Transhumanism is a real concern to me, fundamentally, because it's a false gospel, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some ethical discussions. Is everyone doing okay so far? Any questions? Cool. Might feel a bit like, drinking a fire hose at this point, because I've been pondering this stuff for about a year and a half, and as I've told you, I'm working on a book on it. So I spend most of my evenings and mornings, like early mornings, thinking about this stuff. So apologies if I'm going a bit fast. Just tell me to slow down. Ethically speaking, there are issues with copyright and intellectual property. Suddenly, you have no idea if someone's stealing your work or not. There are big discussions around the idea of is AI image generation art? Can it be art? I don't know. It looks as good as art, but does it count? There's lots of kind of ethical dilemmas there. Privacy protection. Again, the issue with AI is it's what's often referred to as a black box. Basically, you have no idea how it gets from point A to point B. It's usually millions and millions and millions of minute decisions that help it to get from point A to point B. So, for example, let's say we're driving in a car and we're driving along gates here. There's another car next to me, and I'm in a self-driving car. And all of a sudden, for no reason, it suddenly swerves and it smashes into this car. Well, because AI is a black box, at the moment, as it stands, there is no way of knowing why it made that strange decision. And in terms of our privacy, we have no idea of knowing what information it's used to get to that place. So there's a move towards artificial, I wrote about it last week, I think it's called AXI, which essentially is an open form of artificial intelligence where you can go some way towards understanding how it made the decisions that it made. Google is particularly doing a lot of work on this. So that's somewhat helpful, but still, we don't understand how it comes to the decisions it comes to. We have no idea what information it has. If you're familiar with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica stuff, where it used so much of our information and sold so much of our information without our permissions, that's a big concern. We don't know what OpenAI is using from our information. We don't know what any company, what Amazon is using when we buy things on there. We don't know what they're using to make the decisions that they're making. I have a house full of Alexas, and I'm still a little bit nervous about how much it listens to us. These are little Amazon Alexa devices. The ones where you speak to it. Yeah, I love them, but I also don't love the fact that they're listening to me all the time. So those, I mean, when you combine that with artificial intelligence, I mean, Alexa is essentially an artificial intelligence, but talking about narrow, it's very narrow. Siri, oh no. Yeah, okay. that has, that's an issue too. There's also a lot of bias. There's a whole bunch of different biases. There's bias in the algorithms itself. So as the algorithms are written, they inherently have the bias of the people who made them. That's just a reality. Or as you ask, well, maybe I'll back up. That's probably a bit it's confusing things a little bit. There's 3 types of bias that are primarily in AI. First of all is kind of algorithmic bias. Then there's developer bias, and then there's kind of general bias. Now, what does that all mean? First of all, in terms of the algorithms might say that if I get to the word scientist, generally, when I think of a scientist, I think of white male. because proportionately maybe more scientists are white male. So therefore AI will assume that a scientist is a white male. That could be a problem if it's not true, or if it excludes certain people. We don't want that. You get the idea. So that's algorithmic bias. Developer bias is something that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has talked about a lot. He's concerned about that in his company because it's based in San Francisco, which is incredibly liberal. And so naturally, it has inherited some of the bias of the developers that are predominantly in that area. And Sam Altman has said, this is a problem. I'm concerned about this. We need to make it kind of politically neutral. Ironically, both sides of the political aisle have complained about the bias of AI against them. So, so I think in whether you're liberal or whether you're conservative, I think there have been complaints about certain areas. It depends on what you're using. And then kind of the general bias would be, again, people using it, or the way it improves over time. It just learns biases of everyday humans. So the really controversial one was Google using AI. It discovered that it was doing image recognition, and there was a guy who was a black guy who Google couldn't distinguish between him and a gorilla, and that was really bad. It was caused a huge issue, and so they worked really hard to try and fix that. But that was just the bias that they were trying to deal with, trying to cope with, and that was no one's choice. That was just simple image recognition, and so that was a real problem. That was hugely problematic, and of course, that's horrific that kind of thing would happen. So yeah, again, the black box issue, and then what happens? Ethically speaking, what happens if AI surpasses human intelligence? Can we shut it off? Do we shut it off? How do we get to a place where we suddenly say, no, actually, we're not going to use AI? And as we become increasingly dependent on it, it's harder and harder to switch off. Not to mention the fact that you've got all these different organizations, you've got these different countries, essentially in an arms race, to try and be the forerunner in AI. So let's say America says, you know what, we're going to back off AI. You can bet China's not going to. They're going to keep forging ahead. And so because China's going to keep forging ahead, America's like, oh guys, let's keep rushing forward because we need to be ahead. And so you get this race. It becomes an arms race. So this idea of getting to super intelligence and a singularity is very dangerous, because you've got people basically playing Russian roulette to see if they can get there, who will get there first. Very scary. So with all that in mind, let's talk about AI's potential impact on the church. There's a whole bunch of ways that AI could impact the church, and I'm not going to be able to address even a few of them, but here's some. I've been thinking about this for the last little bit. Let's talk about worship, sung worship, for example. Worship leaders could use AI for music transcription. You could say, here's the song "How Great Is Our God" by Chris Tomlin. Give me a chord chart, and it will. And you can say, actually, give me a chord chart in the key of F, in the style of the samba, and it would do it. We're not far away from that kind of thing. ChatGPT can help with song selection already. In fact, ChatGPT can do chord charts and stuff, which is pretty scary. It's not always correct. Audio engineering. That's not my favorite thing. We're not far away from having AI focused sound desks, things like that, where you say, click, automatically adjust for the room, EQ this person's voice based on the sound wave. You get there very quick. That would be a dream for us in our church, because we don't have very many sound guys. What about something like combining AI and augmented reality? There's been a lot of research into augmented reality contact lenses, and that has kind of done the whole kind of AI winter thing, where give me a sec, where they have run out of steam. The technology is not quite there, but it will be there soon. Jaden? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so augmented reality is like, well, back up. Virtual reality is when you put a headset on and you're in this imaginary world, essentially. Augmented reality is when you're using some sort of headset and there is stuff in the real world that appears. So right now, probably the most prominent form of this is the Meta Quest 3, which is the Facebook developed AR, virtual reality headset. And there's an Apple one that's about to come out as well, an Apple headset. It's crazy expensive. But they have the ability to do augmented reality. So you could, I've seen things where people are doing the dishes and they say, actually, I want a screen to be just there. And then they can watch the screen while they do work. Or, there's a million examples of that kind of thing. Soon, you'll be able to have a headset on or glasses or contact lenses where you can walk down the street and see your directions as you drive, that kind of thing. If you have a car that has stuff that appears on the screen, that's essentially augmented reality. There's technology that's coming out that does that kind of thing.
They're spy glasses. That's what they are.
Yeah, essentially. But these imagine a world where we have contact lenses. So you have, realistically, it's where things are going. We won't be using phones for much longer. There'll be much smaller devices where we can use things like that. But imagine on a Sunday when we come together and we're, maybe I'm preaching on Jesus by the Sea of Galilee or something like that. And we can transport ourselves to being in, beside Galilee. We can see what it was actually like in that moment, or see a kind of a generated idea of what that looked like, or the moment that the tomb opened or something like that. There could be some really worshipful moments that come from that kind of thing. Of course, we could have the words, we might change the way that we project words. So it just comes up down here in your eyes. So you can see the words. So you can close your eyes and still worship because you still have them projected on your eyeballs. Who knows? There could be some really interesting things. Could be incredibly distracting as well, because someone might have, maybe Wendy might have the Rough Riders playing on in the background as she's singing. So she'll just suddenly start screaming as the Rough Riders score a point. Who knows? Who knows? Not that Wendy would ever do that. We're seeing things AI being used for sermon prep. I found it helpful as a guide. So what I tend to do with ChatGPT is when I'm preaching, a lot of you know the way I preach. I tend to come up with like a one thing that summarizes my whole message and try and use that to guide my preaching. I'll often run that through ChatGPT after I've come up with it and say, I'm preaching on this passage. Is this logically correct? Does this make sense? And they might say, yeah, but you could probably include this bit. And sometimes it's wrong, sometimes it's right. I find it helpful as a guide for that kind of thing. I've used it for, hey, we're doing a preaching series on Timothy and Titus coming up. What kind of breakdown could I use? And then I'll use that as a guide as I go and read and then study it and see how actually is that what I want to follow or not. But sometimes it's a helpful guide. I think it can be helpful as an information tool, as long as you're not expecting it to do the work of the Holy Spirit for you. And so I think often we throw the baby out with the bathwater and go, no, it's terrible. I'm not in that camp. I think actually it can be really useful if you use it with integrity. For missions, we can talk about missions. Language translation is phenomenal and advancing at an amazing rate with AI. In 2000, I think it was even 2017, maybe 2019, there was a paper that was released where these two scientists, if I remember rightly, had figured out a way to translate languages that it had never heard before using AI. So again, going back to the idea we used before, imagine you see the word table in another language. Well, if you can figure out that that's the word table, you can figure out the word chair is pretty close. That was the example they used. Or if you see these, often clusters of words, you can figure out what they mean by their proximity to one another and by the probability that they'll be related. So we're not far away from having the kind of technology that you see on things like Star Trek and stuff like that, where it interprets a language automatically. We're not a million miles away from that. We did our winter event. Wayne and myself were using Google Translate to talk to some Ukrainians. It was pretty cool, and that technology is really, really advancing very fast. So that could be amazing. It is foreseeable. Is it foreseeable? Is that the word I'm looking for? It's realistic to say that we may well have a Bible in every single language within the generation, within the next 10 to 15 years, with the way that technology is going. It's not inconceivable that could happen, which is a phenomenal thing. Now, of course, you still need people to proofread it and check it. So there are some dilemmas there that we need to work through, but to get to that place is pretty exciting that there's a possibility there. Within the church, things like staffing and stuff like that, it's a great help with productivity. It could be really exciting. I mean, in my case, not so much because we don't have a huge staff team, but if you did, I mean, you might be able to spend more money on pastoral care and less money on administrative tasks, which could be a really good thing. It means that people would get more care that they need. Kids work, you could gamify an experience. Basically, that means you turn learning into a game for kids that help them to engage with biblical study, which could be a wonderful thing. It could be helpful for church planting, as it can do incredibly huge data analysis and help you figure out, okay, where's there a need? What is the need in our town? We feel called to Red Deer. What's the need in Red Deer? How can we serve that need? Where's our fit in the sea of other churches? It can help with administration, so things like graphic design, finances, advertising, all of that stuff. Again, the danger is that we use it as a crutch rather than a tool. We want to use it as a tool to help us pursue the Holy Spirit, not to replace the work of the Holy Spirit. It can also bring potentially unhelpful theology into the midst, which could be a real worry, because you might find that people, instead of looking to maybe a pastor or someone who's trained in theology for help with theology, they might just search for it on ChatGPT, which is ultimately, remember, it's not thinking, it's just providing predictive answers. So it will just give the most popular answer rather than the most true, which is not good. Let's talk about transhumanism as one of these theological challenges. I believe that transhumanism fundamentally is a false gospel. It's this idea that we're trying to leave our bodies and live eternally in a digital world. Essentially, what it's saying is, if you want to have eternal life, then you need to subscribe to this ideology so that you can live for eternity in this digital realm. Now, it's nonsense because you're still you can't live for eternity on a server. And is it even your conscience? Like, philosophically, I would argue no, it's just a copy of your conscience. So it's at the moment, on its face, it seems to be nonsense, but it's still getting a lot of traction because people are saying, hey, there's a lot of rules with Jesus, but I still want eternal life. Oh, transhumanism. And so it's pretty scary. And so we need to be aware of that kind of false gospel. It's kind of echoes of Gnosticism, which is this idea that the material world is bad and the spiritual world is good. It's not where we want to be.
The digital world be like the child of the material world, though? Isn't that kind of contradictory of itself?
Well, the digital world is still ultimately just the physical world. Yeah. So but you feel like you're in the, you're right. And again, they want to transcend the limitations of the body, but we know that we're made in God's image. So that's a problem. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. A few years ago, Anthony Lewandowski started the first Church of AI, where they literally worship AI. It closed in 2021, which is good. But I think in the last few months, he's tried to open it again. It's concerning. So here are some things that we need to think about that addresses some of these things. We have a biblical call to good stewardship. So as the church, we are called to have stewardship, have dominion over all creation. That includes AI. So we want to be careful about not being subservient to AI. That would be bad. The church has an opportunity to ensure that AI is developed in a way that is healthy, in a way that honors God, that is developed in a way that promotes human flourishing. So we don't want to promote anything that is going to greatly exacerbate poverty, for example. AI must never diminish or disregard human worth. That's critical. It needs to enhance and support it. And so for this reason, we need to be part of the conversation about AI. And my fear, I run this website, churchandai.com, and I write for that. And I'm shocked at how how few people are having conversations about AI. People see it as this fad, and part of my message today is to say, look, actually, it's been something that we've talked about for a long time. We're starting to see it, and just as we're starting to see it, people are going, it's scary, and we as the church need to have a voice into this stuff, because we can shape how it moves forward in a healthy way. Second, provision for the poor and pursuit of justice are vital. Are they the main mission of the church? I would argue no, but they're pretty primary. It's pretty up there still. Our mission is to worship God, to fulfill the Great Commission, and then underneath those two things is to then help the poor and the needy and the oppressed. It's a vital thing. Isaiah 58 reminds us that when we serve the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, our light will shine in the darkness. Proverbs 19:17 teaches that kindness to the poor is like a loan to the Lord, and he will give a reward to the lender. Jesus identified with the poor and taught that serving them is tantamount to serving him. So that in Matthew 25. James exhorts believers to feed the hungry. Micah 6:8 and Isaiah 1:7 instruct us to pursue justice. Now, when I say that it's subservient to those two things, that's not to say that it's not important. It's vitally, critically important. I think I read this book actually just this week called The Mission of the Church, and it's by Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert, I think his name was. And they were saying, the primary mission of the church is the worship of God and the fulfillment of the Great Commission. But that doesn't mean that because serving the poor isn't primary, that we give up on it. It's still hugely, hugely important. And I just want to make sure that's really clear, because I think sometimes it can sometimes be communicated that, okay, because this is our first focus, these don't matter. That's not true at all. So if AI leads to an economic singularity, so the rich get incredibly rich, or everyone gets incredibly rich, or the poor get incredibly poor, we need to say, okay, what happens? What would happen if poverty is eliminated? If that's one of our key calls, do we just go, good job, everyone? Or from a theological point of view, do we say, actually, we don't think that will ever happen because the Bible's calling us to that? I don't know. Some of these are questions rather than answers. In that worst case, we have a call to speak up on the needs of the oppressed, and to do so with respect and dignity and honor. We have a duty to fulfill our obligation to the poor, just as we have done for centuries upon centuries. Before there were any welfare systems, the church has been one of the preeminent forces for good in terms of serving the poor and the oppressed, and we will still need to be that. If in the worst case scenario, we will have to stand up for the rights of those who need us, and step out into the world and serve them in a way that we haven't done for generations. It might be time to really step everything up a gear. Next, we need to recognize that work is a blessing from the Lord. I think sometimes, too often, in fact, we see work as a negative thing. I hear that all the time. I can't wait to just free myself from the obligation of work. Well, actually, work was an integral part of God's good creation. Work was part of the pre-fall world. There is a goodness about work that we need to recognize, and our world tells us that we need to escape work, but the Bible tells us that work is a good thing if it's done for God's glory. Now, that doesn't mean that your specific job is the thing that you might be called to do. The Bible calls believers to work with all their hearts as working for the Lord and not for men. That's Colossians 3. We also recognize that the importance of Sabbath implies the importance of work for the rest of the week. There's clearly intrinsic value to work. Now, something really interesting. We're not too far away from the end here. In 1930, there was a guy called John Maynard Keynes who predicted that something he called the economic problem would be solved, and he would need 3-hour shifts or maybe a 15-hour week to put off the problem of the old Adam urge in us, and so that we work to be contented. So he recognized that actually, if we get to a place where, economically speaking, we are so rich we don't have to work, actually probably still going to have to work at least 15 hours a week, because otherwise that old Adam urge in us is going to bubble up. It's going to say, oh, we need to do something. We need to get out and we need to work. We need to find something to do. It's why retirement is not biblical. Repurposing, biblical. But retirement, no. God has not designed us to then, to get to a certain age and then just sit on a couch and read. He's still got work for us to do. It might just not look the same as it did 30 years earlier. I think that's really fascinating that even 100 years ago, John Maynard Keynes recognized that we could eliminate work, but actually we still need it. There's that fundamental urge in us to work. The Bible shows us that work is more than a hobby just to keep us interested, but it's a valuable, meaningful, and fulfilling part of life. So to miss work is to miss a fundamental part of God's design for humanity, which isn't a good thing. So what might happen is that the kind of menial tasks that we do for jobs that people don't like to do can get put aside and handled by AI, so people can work in more creative, more freeing, more releasing jobs that they find more fulfillment in. May even find that actually, because I don't have to work, I can focus on serving Jesus. I can give all my full attention to spreading the gospel. There's all sorts of things. The other side of that is that people might be so distracted by their own wealth that it makes the gospel incredibly difficult to penetrate particularly our Western world, but potentially the whole world. Okay, finally, idolatry. And then after that, we're going to talk about 7 guidelines as we move forward. Idolatry. In Exodus 20, God is clear that his people are to worship him alone, but we're getting dangerously close to a place where we're worshiping technology as societally. I mean, anything that holds a position above God is idolatrous. And society is already gripped by the digital world in terms of things like social media and stuff like that. It's not going to help. You take social media, dating apps, pornography, all of this stuff. You infuse it with AI. That's not a recipe for something healthy or good. It's very easy to imagine a scenario where an increasingly efficient and personalized AI could cause people to inadvertently worship something other than God. Technicism, this is idolatry. This idea that when we place an inappropriate amount of trust in man-made creations, that's a problem. It's called technicism. As we saw a few Sundays ago, our job is to cut through the noise, the distractions, the hindrances, the sin that so easily ensnares us, and to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. It's easier said than done when the world is getting better and better at competing for our attention. There's other theological considerations. So here are some questions. To what extent can churches implement AI and still be considered church? There was a church in Germany that produced an entire church service, including songs, through AI as a test. I don't know why they even tried that. That freaks me out, honestly. But they did it. What about people who genuinely feel that they've entered into a committed relationship with AI? Like genuinely, and not just some fad or propaganda opportunity, but they really do feel, actually, you can't tell me who to love. Love is love. You get the idea. You've been there before. What about potential persecution and genocide at the hands of drone swarms? What do we do about that? Lots of things to talk about. I'm hoping we're going to have lots of time for discussion. Just a quick perusal through 7 guidelines for churches. This is what I'm writing a book about, is essentially, in light of all this stuff, what are things that we can do right now? Well, the first thing is we can prioritize relationship, community, and pastoral care. This is primarily for church leaders, but I think it's beneficial for all of us who have the ability to lead people around us. As the world gets increasingly individualistic and AI makes us less and less relationally focused, we need to be people that say, no, you know what? There is nowhere that does relationship like the church when it's functioning in its calling. There is nowhere that makes people feel as welcome and as loved as the church when it's fulfilling what God is calling it to do. I think we are about to hit a crisis, a relational crisis, particularly among Gen Z, which would be kind of Chet Amber, Jaden's age, Bronson's age, and my kids' generation as well. I think there's going to be a bit of a crash because suddenly there's this realization that the world is not all it's cracked up to be, and being on your own all the time is very unhealthy. And I think people are going to realize that. And so I think we'll see a turn away from that, from AI, and an opportunity to say, you want relationship? You can have meaningful relationships with us, but more importantly, you can have a meaningful relationship with your Creator, with your Heavenly Father. That is a wonderful thing. And so I think there is a need that will be fulfilled. And so I think when you hear us talking about wanting to be the most loving place in Red Deer, I think this is one of the reasons why I push that, is because I think we are getting increasingly less relational. But that pendulum is only going to go so far, and people are going to realize that it's not working. It's not healthy. It's not good. We can move from sitting on the front porch where we used to see everyone to the back porch where we can hide from everyone, but eventually who's going to be there when you need help? So first of all, prioritize relationship, community, and pastoral care. We want to be super relational. This one, preemptively foster congregational resilience. Okay, it's kind of long-winded there, but the idea here is saying, as a congregation, we want to do things like this so that we're aware of what's happening in AI, so that we are ready for the changes that are coming, that inevitably will come, whether it's as extreme as we've talked about or not. There will be inevitable changes in our society. So we want to be ready for it. So we want to be ready as a congregation, first by understanding the challenges around AI, but secondly, by building a strong understanding of who God is, a strong focus on God. We want to talk about fixing our eyes on Jesus. We want to talk about things like our perspective of God determines the direction of our life. We want to make God the primary thing. We want to make the gospel the primary thing, because that will help us to stay resilient in a changing world. We want to build our house on the rock rather than on the shifting sands or the storms of AI. We want to be careful to make sure that we're safe here. We have congregational resilience. Third, we want to build adaptability into church structures. What I mean by that is that we want to be ready to change with the world. We have a system where so many of our structures are traditions. They're not biblical values, they're traditions. So, for example, how many churches do you know that have a youth pastor, an associate pastor, a children's pastor, and then a lead pastor, and then various other things? Or, that's usually how it goes. How many churches do you turn up and there's going to be coffee at the beginning, somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes of sung worship. The message will be somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes, probably some notices. Everyone will kind of mill around and then we'll walk away. You know what you're expecting in churches at the moment. Those are traditions that are formed. Well, actually, as the world changes, we need to be prepared to change any of those things that aren't biblically based, those things that are traditions for the sake of it. Maybe we won't have an administrative team in churches. So, talk about a church like, well, let's talk about a mega church. Let's talk about a mega church that has a staff of 50 people. Maybe 20 of those or more are administrative staff. Maybe we don't need those, but maybe what we really do need are relational pastors more than ever to reach that relational need. So we want to have adaptability here. We want to be prepared to say, we're not just doing something because it's the way we've always done it. As the world changes, we need to be ready to change with it. We want to embrace positive technological developments. So I argue that we should be technological semi-Luddites. What I mean by that is the Luddites were a group of people in, I think, the 1700s, or maybe possibly into the 1800s, I forget now, in England, who were really not impressed at some of the technological inventions that were coming, because it was putting people out of work. There was a lot more issues than that. It's far more complex than that. But essentially, they went and destroyed so much of this technology as a response. And they were the Luddites, and that term has come to refer to anyone who is really anti-technology. I'm saying that in terms of AI, we want to be semi-Luddites. We want to be on the fence with some stuff, and we want to be all in on others. I think too often, again, I referred to this earlier, I meet people who are one extreme or the other, like don't want anything to do with AI. They put their head in the sand. That's really dangerous. It's not helpful as the world is about to change. We need to engage with this stuff. On the other hand, you have people who are technological optimists, they call themselves. They're like, oh, it's only going to be good in the long term. That's not helpful either, because clearly, as you've seen, there's the potential for horrific bad things to happen. And so we want to be somewhere in the middle. So when there's positive things, so if it helps with administration and saves us money that we can then spend on ministry, wonderful. Let's embrace that. If it helps us with the study of God's word in a genuine way, amazing. Let's embrace that. If it helps us to not have to drive 12 hours to Manitoba because a self-driving car can do it and you can sleep on the way, fantastic. Let's embrace it. Not that I'm dreaming too much for that world. Oh man, that'd be so good. But we want to embrace the positive things and recognize the negative things. Fifth, we want to stay informed in this rapidly changing environment. This kind of comes back to what we were saying before. We have to be aware of what's going on. It's so important that we're not just burying our heads in the sand. We have to have an awareness of what's going on. We can only do some of those other things. We can only respond to positive developments. We can only have adaptability in our church if we understand the climate in which we're focused. If we were going to a mission field in let's say in Africa, we would get to know the culture that we were living with first before we did anything. I think we've made this mistake here that we assume that our culture is unchanging. And in fact, even our generations are changing. What used to be, say, a 20-year span of generations is now smaller and smaller because technology is changing so quickly that the world I grew up in compared to even the world that Bronson is growing up in, there's a 20-year difference there. That world is vastly different in a way that between me and Gary wasn't so different. There's differences, of course, but the difference between Bronson and me is accelerated, and we need to be aware of those things. All that to say, we need to keep up with what's going on. If we want to engage with future generations, if we want to have an understanding of what's going on with AI, we need to be aware of how this is shifting, how it's impacting our kids, how it's impacting our society as a whole. It's very important that we don't just bury our heads in the sand. Next, we want to proactively pray for God-given wisdom. Now, you might remember I preached a sermon on Proverbs in the summer all about wisdom. Biblical wisdom, I argued, is this grace-given, awe-driven closeness with God that leads to Christ-like character. So we're not going to talk about all of those things. If you're interested in that, I'll send you the sermon again. But that's what Proverbs shows us about wisdom. Wisdom is godly wisdom is fundamentally different from earthly wisdom, and we need it. We need it in this world where we're talking about things like singularities and superintelligence and stuff like that. What we need is God-given wisdom, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also to recognize when we need to be alarmed as well. With God-given wisdom, we can stand strong, knowing that, in my opinion, AI is never going to destroy our world. How do I know that? Because Jesus has got to come back. So the world is not going to get destroyed before Jesus comes back. I feel the same way about climate change. Does that mean it doesn't exist at all? I'm not saying that. Does that mean that our world may be wrecked by that stuff? Well, it may be wrecked potentially by climate change. I don't know. I don't know enough about it. It may be wrecked by AI, but it's never going to destroy humanity because Jesus has to come back. And so when we trust on God-given biblical wisdom, it stops us from getting too concerned about some of these things, in my mind, at least. And finally, we want to keep an undistracted focus on the mission of the church. You can guess which chapter I've been writing about this week. I've been reading all about the mission of the church. Primarily, our mission as the church is to bring God the glory that he deserves, to glorify him, to worship him. It's the chief end of man. What is the chief end of man? To worship him and glorify him together. Is that the right word? To enjoy him, to glorify him and enjoy him together, or enjoy him forever. We're called to worship him. The Great Commission, we're called to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, but also teaching them to obey all that Jesus has commanded. So under the Great Commission, that comes all of the social justice stuff. That comes for the preaching the poor, all of these things. What the issue with things like, say, liberation theology and things like that is that they put social justice all the way to the top. We care about justice. It's just part of the Great Commission, and it's part of leading people to glorify God forever. By keeping a focus on that mission, we recognize that AI cannot wreck that. AI will never be able to stop us from worshiping God. It will never be able to stop us from preaching the gospel. It could try, but somehow, let's say we have an authoritarian regime out to destroy Christians, Well, it could, fine. It's still not going to stop me from preaching the gospel. It's not going to stop us from serving the poor. When we keep that focus on the mission of the church, it puts all of this stuff with AI into a perspective that says, actually, it really doesn't affect our biblical calling very much. It might change how we do it, but it doesn't affect the fact that we do it. And so we can have confidence in that. By keeping our focus on the church's mission, it stops us from getting distracted by, what did we call it? What's it called last week? We saw it in Timothy, like endless myths and genealogies and speculation and things like that. We don't want to focus on that. We want to focus on the mission of the church, and that will help us to navigate this season. So those are my 7 guidelines for churches. I think those are, as far as I can tell, they cover everything. I've been mulling over this for quite some time. I'd love to know if there's any questions, really. At this point, I've got some discussion questions that I'd be happy to tell you about, but I would love to know if you have any questions, if you have any comments, any thoughts. Let me know. What do you think?